Okay, so in this video, we're going to learn about polynomials. From the definition, a polynomial is a mathematical expression consisting of variables, coefficients, and constants. They can have one or several terms. Okay, let's break this down. What is a variable? A variable is when you have an unknown value and you set a letter to it. So like x, y, z, those are all variables. You don't know the value of what they are, but that's why you set the letter to it. And x squared, you can raise them to powers, such as x squared, x to the second power, or like n to the 50th power. These are variables, and these are raised to powers. Okay, so what's a coefficient now? A coefficient is the number, just in simple words, it's the number before a variable. So like 2x to the fourth, the coefficient is 2, and that just states how many of the x to the fourth there are. There are 2x to the fourth. So let's say 3x to the fourth, the coefficient is 3, and there's 3 of those x to the fourth. So if x to the fourth were our bananas, here there are 2 bananas, and here there are 3 bananas. That coefficients just state how many of the variables there are. Okay, and now let's finally see what a constant is. A constant is when you have a number and there's no variable assigned to it. So like 14 is a constant. 16 is also a constant. And also, I'm a little bit wrong about it having no variable assigned to it. There is a variable assigned to it. It's just an invisible variable. And it would be like 14, let's say we have n to the 0. N to the 0, that's just 1, because anything to the raised to the 0th power is 1. But it's the same thing as being 14 times 1, which is 14. So that's what your constant is. It's basically, you don't see the variable because it's raised to the 0th power, so that's a constant. And just a quick note, a coefficient just means that you're multiplying them. So like in this case, you're just multiplying them. It's the same thing. You just don't write the multiplication sign. Yeah. Okay, now let's see some different kinds of polynomial like names that we have. So let's go first with a monomial. So from our definition, we can see that it says that polynomials can have one or several terms. So a monomial is when a polynomial has one term. So a monomial is a one-term polynomial. Okay, so that seems pretty easy. So that would be like x squared is a one-term polynomial. There's only one term. A term basically means that like it's separated by an operation. So like x squared plus y, those are two terms because it's separated by the operation here, but you probably need that. So x squared is a one-term polynomial. Y cubed is a one-term polynomial. 1 is a constant, and that's a one-term polynomial because we have 1x to 0. You can see it like that, or just like 1, because the definition says polynomials can have variables, coefficients, and constants. Is 0 polynomial? Well, yeah, it's called the 0 polynomial. Even though it doesn't have a value, it's still a term. It just says that the expression's value is 0. And you can see this as 0 times x to the 0th power, which is 0 times 1, which is just 0. So yeah, that's also considered a monomial. Okay, and if monomials have the same, are raised to the same power, and if there's the same variable, you can add them. And if they fit all those conditions, they're called like terms. So like, for example, if I have x squared, or let's try n to the 4th, and we have 3n to the 4th, and we want to add these. So basically n to the fourth, and there's another n to the fourth. So these are the same variable and raised to the same power. So that's why we can add them. And since, let's say, n to the fourth is our bananas. So we have one banana here, and then we have 3 bananas here. So that means in total we have 4 bananas, or in other words, 4n to the fourth. Okay, so seems pretty simple. They're called like terms if they're the same variable and raised to the same power, and you can just add them. Now let's say if we have 2 terms and we want to add or subtract them, but they're not like terms. That's called a binomial, which is just a 2-term polynomial. For example, we have x to the 7 plus y to the 7. They have the same power, but they're not the same variable, so you have to leave it like that. You can't simplify this any further, and it's a 2-term polynomial. There's 2 terms separated by the operation, which is addition, and that's just called the binomial. So, and then you can also subtract binomials, so you can have like n to the 4 minus x to the just x. That's also binomial because you can't simplify it any further, and there's 2 terms. Okay, lastly we have our 3-term polynomials, and that's called a trinomial. So like trinomial, you can probably guess that it's a 3-term polynomial and you can't simplify it any further, so you just leave it like that and call it a trinomial. So for example, I could have x4 minus y cubed plus n. That's a trinomial. You can have x to the 4th plus 1 plus y. That's a trinomial. So yeah, trinomial consists of 3 monomials, and binomials consist of 2 monomials, and they're not like terms. Okay, so that so far seems pretty simple. It's just terminology, and you probably knew that. So yeah, let's move on to a little example to check if we know our notation. So I'll make a quick table. Okay, so we want to find what the coefficient and the degrees are of this polynomial. So we want to find the coefficient and degree. Okay, so coefficients, there's multiple coefficients. So we can see that our coefficients are, so we have -8, since that comes before the variable and says how many there are. It just comes before the variable. And +4 is a coefficient, -6 is a coefficient, and 2 actually is a coefficient, because we have our invisible variable x to the 0th power, so it does come before a variable. And that doesn't mean 2 isn't a constant. 2 is still a constant, but it's also a coefficient. So in other words, every constant is a coefficient, because you can just have that x to 0. Okay, and now we want to find what the degree is. So a degree is the highest power raised of any variable in a polynomial. So like, for example, in this big polynomial, we have our degree is 3, because that's the highest power of any variable that was raised. So like, this exponent is 2, this exponent is 1, and this exponent is 0. But the highest is the cube, the 3, and that's just our degree. So yeah, a degree is the highest power in a polynomial. Okay, and finally, let's try some examples of adding and subtracting some polynomials. So I'll just write the first example of adding polynomials down quickly. Okay, so our job is we want to add these 2 polynomials. So remember that we can only add terms if they're like terms, which means they have to be the same variable and they have to have the same power. So we can see that the only variable in this entire addition is x, so we only have to focus on the power for this example. So let's try, so I can see that there's a x to the 4, so let's try and see if there's any other x to the 4s. No, so that means we only have 3x to the 4. Okay, and now let's try our x to the cubed variable. So we have 8x to the cubed, and then minus 2x to the cubed. So 8 of those minus 2 of those, which is 6x to the cubed. Okay, simple enough. Now we have to do our x squared term. So we can see we have a minus 2x squared and plus x squared. So minus 2 plus 1 is minus 1. So minus 1 x squared, and I don't have to write the minus 1. So yeah, and in case it was confusing you, the parentheses don't matter in addition. So, and then let's finally try our x to 1. So this would be x to 1. And say we have 6x to the 1, and we want to add an x to the 1. So 1x to the 1. 6 plus 1 is 7x to the 1. And then we have our constants. So we can see that there's only a negative 2 as our constant, and there's nothing here. So yeah, this is our sum for addition of the polynomials. You can see that we can only add like terms. And let's try one subtraction example. Okay, so our job here is that we want to subtract these two polynomials. So let's try. So first we have to distribute the negative. So what I mean by that is that before this polynomial comes a negative 1. So it's negative 1 times this polynomial. So I would have to distribute the negative 1 using the distributive property through all those terms. So negative 1 times that term, negative 1 times that term, and then negative 1 times that term, and then the last term. So if we do this really quickly, we have negative 1 times the first term, so negative 1 times 2x to the 4th power, negative 2x to the 4th power, and minus 8x squared, negative 1 times that, plus 8x squared, negative 1 times minus 6x is positive 6x, and yeah, wait, 1 second, positive 6x, and negative 1 times 5, positive 5, is negative 5. So that's just our distributive property. So that we just got rid of the parentheses, basically, is what we just did by distributing the negative 1. The parentheses don't matter here because there's no negative for it. So we can just bring that back down here. 3x to the 4th minus 4x cubed plus 6x squared minus 1. And now let's combine the like terms. So again, starting with I like to start with the highest degree first and see if there's any common, which there is. So 3x to the 4th minus 2x to the 4th. 3 of those minus 2 of those is 1 of those. So we're left with 1x to the 4th. 3 minus 2 is 1. Let's try our third degree. There's only one x cubed term, and it's minus 4x cubed. We're left with that. Nothing to simplify it with. Okay, let's try x squared term. There's 6x squared plus 8x squared is 14x squared. And then our x term, we have 6x plus 6x. There's only one of those. And then our constants. There's two constant terms, minus 1, minus 5. So minus 1 minus 5 is minus 6. So that is our value for the subtraction of those two polynomials. So yeah, in this video we just went over some polynomial terminology, like the different terminology, 1 term, 2 term, 3 term, monomial, binomial, trinomial, and we also just went over how to add and subtract polynomials, and we can only add or subtract the terms if they're like terms. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.